crimson setting sunset. Rosie Dawson had never expected love, only duty. But just as she was about to marry a man she didn't want, Rhett Tate stormed into the church, his gun drawn, his voice rough with warning. He grabbed her hand, his grip unrelenting. "You were never meant for him, Rosie," he murmured. "And now you never will be." Chapter 1. The Unwanted Union. The air in the small, clapboard church of Harmony Creek was thick with the scent of wilting wildflowers and nervous anticipation. Rosie Dawson stood stiffly at the altar, her ivory dress a hand-me-down from her elder sister, carefully altered, feeling more like a shroud than a symbol of celebration. The fabric, once vibrant, now seemed to mirror the faded hope in her heart. Her gaze drifted to the stained glass window depicting a shepherd guiding his flock, a stark contrast to the lost lamb she felt herself to be. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room upon her. Her father, Silas Dawson, a man whose weathered face and calloused hands spoke of a life battling the harsh realities of the frontier, stood ramrod straight, his pride evident even in the rigid set of his shoulders. Her mother, Martha, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, a mixture of relief and sadness swirling within her. Relief that her youngest daughter was finally securing a stable future, sadness that it came at such a cost. The groom, Jedediah Jed Collins, was a man twice Rosie's age, his wealth and influence in Harmony Creek the only things that recommended him to the Dawson family. He stood beside her, his fleshy hand clammy against her own, his breath heavy with the scent of cheap whiskey and self-importance. He was a man who saw women as possessions and Rosie, a means to solidify his already considerable holdings. His smile didn't reach his eyes, cold and calculating, assessing her like he would a prize heifer at auction. Rosie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She'd pleaded, she'd reasoned, she'd even tried to run, but her father's word was law in the Dawson household. "It's for the best, Rosie," he'd said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Jedediah can provide for you, for all of us. This drought, it's taken its toll. We need this." His words echoed the desperation that had settled like dust over their ranch, choking the life out of everything, including her spirit. The preacher, a thin, nervous man named Reverend Johnson, droned on about the sanctity of marriage, about duty and obedience. Rosie barely heard him. Her mind was a whirlwind of fragmented memories, the feel of the wind whipping through her hair as she rode her beloved mare, Belle, across the open plains, the laughter she'd shared with her childhood friend, Samuel, before he'd left Harmony Creek to seek his fortune, the quiet evenings spent on the porch, listening to her grandmother spin tales of brave pioneers and star-crossed lovers. Those were the things that felt real, not this suffocating charade. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure an image of escape, of a life where she could make her own choices, where love wasn't a transaction, but a wild, untamed thing. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to her despair. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors of the church burst open with a force that rattled the very foundations. A hush fell over the congregation, broken only by the frantic fluttering of a startled dove that had nested in the rafters. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun, stood a figure that seemed to have stepped straight out of one of her grandmother's legendary tales. Tall and imposing, he was dressed in worn leather and denim, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. A Colt peacemaker was holstered low on his hip, its presence a stark violation of the church's sanctuary. The air crackled with an unspoken danger, a raw, primal energy that sent shivers down Rosie's spine. He moved with a predatory grace, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden floor, each step deliberate, each movement purposeful. His eyes, when they finally met Rosie's, were the color of a stormy sky, intense and unwavering. They held a depth of emotion she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of anger, determination, and something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. Jedediah, sputtering with indignation, stepped forward. "Who in tarnation are you? This is a private ceremony." The stranger ignored him, his gaze locked on Rosie. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough, like the rumble of distant thunder, yet it carried a strange resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "This wedding is over." Gasps rippled through the church. Silas Dawson surged forward, his face contorted with fury. "You have no right, this stranger Rhett Tate," though Rosie didn't know his name, yet raised his hand, silencing Silas with a gesture that was both commanding and surprisingly gentle. He never took his eyes off Rosie. "Rosalie Dawson," he said, her name sounding like a forgotten prayer on his lips. "You were promised to me. Long ago. Before everything changed." Confusion warred with a flicker of something else, a nascent hope in Rosie's heart. Promised? She'd never met this man before in her life. Or had she? There was a flicker of recognition in the depths of his eyes, a haunting familiarity that tugged at the edges of her memory. Jedediah, regaining his composure, puffed out his chest. "You're lying. She's promised to me, by her father's word." Rhett finally turned his attention to Jedediah, his gaze cold and dismissive. "Her father's word means nothing. Not when it goes against a blood oath." He drew his gun, the movement swift and fluid, the metallic click echoing in the sudden silence. He didn't point it at Jedediah, but held it loosely at his side, a clear and present threat. The congregation recoiled, a collective gasp of fear and disbelief filling the church. Martha Dawson fainted, her limp body caught by one of her older daughters. Rhett's eyes returned to Rosie, softening slightly, though the underlying intensity remained.
"Come with me, Rosie. Now."
It wasn't a request, it was a command, yet it held a strange undercurrent of pleading. Rosie hesitated, her mind reeling. This was madness. She was supposed to marry Jedediah, secure her family's future, accept her fate. But as she looked into Rhett's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time, a glimmer of hope, a chance for something more. A chance to escape the gilded cage she'd been trapped in. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against his outstretched palm. His skin was rough, calloused, but warm, radiating a strength that both terrified and exhilarated her. The moment their fingers intertwined, it felt like a spark ignited, a connection forged in the heart of chaos. He pulled her towards him, his grip firm but not painful. "You were never meant for him, Rosie," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, his breath warm against her ear. "And now you never will be." He turned, pulling her with him towards the open doors, towards the blinding sunlight and the uncertain future that awaited them. The stunned silence of the church was broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the pounding of Rosie's own heart, a wild, untamed rhythm that echoed the promise and the peril of the path she had chosen. She glanced back one last time, at her father's furious, disbelieving face, at the chaos she was leaving behind. But as Rhett led her out of the church and into the vast, unforgiving landscape, she knew there was no turning back. Her old life was over. A new one, fraught with danger and uncertainty, had just begun. And for the first time in a long time, Rosie felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in years: freedom. Chapter 2. A storm of gunfire and promises. The world outside the church was a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere within. The midday sun beat down on Harmony Creek, baking the dusty main street and casting long shadows from the weathered buildings. The air was thick with the scent of dust, horse manure, and the faint, metallic tang of impending violence. As Rhett pulled Rosie towards a pair of saddled horses tethered near the hitching post, a shout ripped through the air.
"Stop them!"
It was Jedediah, his face red with rage, his voice hoarse with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Several men, loyal to Jedediah and armed with rifles and shotguns, emerged from the saloon across the street, their movements fueled by a mixture of loyalty and the promise of reward. They formed a ragged line, blocking the path to freedom. Rhett didn't hesitate. He pushed Rosie behind him, shielding her with his body, his gun still held loosely at his side. His eyes, narrowed against the glare of the sun, scanned the approaching men, assessing the threat. He recognized a few of them hard men, known for their quick tempers and loose morals. Men who wouldn't hesitate to shoot first and ask questions later. "This ain't your fight," Collins Rhett called out, his voice calm but firm, carrying across the dusty street. "Let her go. This is between me and her." Jedediah, emboldened by the presence of his men, stepped forward, his hand resting on the pearl-handled revolver tucked into his waistband. "She's my bride, Tate. I paid a good price for her, and I ain't letting some two-bit outlaw steal her from me." Rosie, her heart pounding in her chest, peeked out from behind Rhett. The sight of the armed men, their faces grim and determined, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She'd never witnessed such blatant violence, such raw aggression. The sheltered life she'd led, for all its constraints, had at least offered a semblance of safety. Now that safety was shattered. "She's not a piece of property," Collins Rhett retorted, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. "She's a woman, with a mind and a will of her own. And she chooses to come with me. She don't have a choice." Jedediah spat, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. "She's bound by her father's word, by the laws of this town." Rhett's jaw tightened. He knew Jedediah was right in a way. The law, as it stood in Harmony Creek, favored men like Collins. But Rhett had his own code, a code forged in the crucible of a harsh and unforgiving past. A code that placed loyalty and honor above the dictates of corrupt officials and self-serving landowners. "The law can be bought," Collins Rhett said, his voice low and menacing. "But some things can't. And Rosie Dawson, she's one of them." A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the nervous shuffling of feet and the distant caw of a crow. Rosie could feel the tension radiating from Rhett's body, the coiled energy of a predator about to strike. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that bloodshed was imminent. Suddenly, one of Jedediah's men, a young, hot-headed cowboy named Billy, raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Rhett's chest. "Enough talk," he yelled, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and bravado. "You're under arrest, Tate." Rhett's reaction was instantaneous. He moved with a speed that belied his size, his gun coming up in a blur, the roar of the Colt Peacemaker shattering the stillness. The bullet struck Billy in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering to the ground. The shot unleashed a storm of gunfire. Bullets whizzed through the air, splintering wood and kicking up dust. Rosie screamed, instinctively ducking down, covering her head with her hands. Rhett grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the horses. "Get on," he yelled, his voice barely audible above the din of gunfire. He helped her onto the back of a sturdy-looking bay mare, the same one she'd ridden countless times as a child, a surge of bittersweet recognition flooding through her.
Belle.
It was her own horse. Rhett must have known. He swung himself onto his own mount, a powerful black stallion, its muscles rippling beneath its glossy coat. As they spurred their horses into a gallop, bullets continued to rain down around them. Rosie clung to Belle's mane, her body pressed low against the horse's neck, her eyes squeezed shut. The wind whipped past her face, carrying with it the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sounds of shouting and gunfire. She could hear Rhett returning fire, his shots precise and deadly. She didn't dare look back, but she knew he was protecting her, putting his own life on the line to ensure her escape. They raced out of Harmony Creek, leaving behind the chaos and violence, leaving behind the life she had known. The open plains stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, offering both freedom and peril. As the sounds of gunfire faded behind them, Rosie finally dared to open her eyes. She looked up at Rhett, his face grim and determined, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was a stranger, an outlaw, a man who had just stolen her from her own wedding. Yet, in that moment, she felt a strange sense of trust, a belief that he was her only hope. He glanced down at her, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right, Rosie?" he asked, his voice hoarse from shouting. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat choked with emotion. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I promised you a new life, Rosie," he said, his voice low and sincere. "And I intend to keep that promise, even if it kills me." His words, spoken against the backdrop of the vast, open sky, resonated with a power that both terrified and thrilled her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same. She was no longer the dutiful daughter, the reluctant bride. She was Rhett Tate's stolen bride, riding headlong into an unknown future with a man she barely knew, but who had already captured a part of her heart. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was stirring, a sense of adventure, a spark of defiance, and the first, faint glimmer of hope for a love that was as wild and untamed as the frontier itself. She looked up at the endless blue, a sudden gust of wind catching her hair. She did not yet know the road, but for the first time, it felt as though she was charting a course she herself had chosen. Chapter 3. The Long Ride to Nowhere. The sun beat down mercilessly as they rode, turning the landscape into a shimmering mirage. The vast plains, stretching out in every direction, seemed to offer no respite, no sanctuary. Dust devils danced across the horizon, mocking their desperate flight. Rosie, unaccustomed to such prolonged exposure, felt her skin burning, her throat parched. The elegant wedding dress, now torn and stained with dust, felt like a cruel reminder of the life she had left behind. Belle, though tired, responded to Rosie's gentle urging, her familiar gait a small comfort in this terrifying new reality. Rhett, riding slightly ahead on his powerful black stallion, seemed tireless, his body a study in controlled strength. He constantly scanned the horizon, his eyes alert for any sign of pursuit. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of hooves on the hard-packed earth, the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead, and the rasping breaths of the horses. Rosie's initial fear began to give way to a gnawing exhaustion, both physical and emotional. She longed for water, for shade, for some semblance of normalcy. She stole glances at Rhett, trying to decipher the enigma that he was. He was an outlaw, a man who lived outside the law, yet he had rescued her. He was rough, unrefined, yet he had treated her with a surprising gentleness. He was a stranger, yet she felt an inexplicable connection to him, a sense of destiny that both intrigued and frightened her. Finally, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the plains, Rhett signaled a halt. They had reached a small, rocky outcrop, a cluster of boulders providing a meager amount of shade. A narrow, winding creek, barely more than a trickle, snaked its way through the rocks, offering the promise of water. Rhett dismounted, his movements stiff from hours in the saddle. He helped Rosie down, his hands strong and steady, his touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary. She avoided his gaze, her cheeks flushed, a mixture of exhaustion and a strange, unfamiliar nervousness, making her heart flutter. He led the horses to the creek, allowing them to drink their fill. Then, he filled his canteen and offered it to Rosie. She drank deeply, the cool water a soothing balm to her parched throat. "We'll rest here for the night," Rhett said, his voice low and gravelly. "We need to put some distance between us and Harmony Creek before dawn." He unsaddled the horses, tending to them with a practiced ease that spoke of years spent living on the frontier. He built a small fire, using dried brush and scrub he gathered from the surrounding area. The flames, though small, offered a welcome warmth against the growing chill of the evening. Rosie sat on a flat rock, watching him, her mind still reeling from the day's events. She hugged herself, trying to ward off the growing cold, both physical and emotional. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions, with a tension that was both unsettling and strangely exciting. Finally, she found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "Why did you do it, Rhett? Why did you rescue me?" He looked up from the fire, his eyes, illuminated by the flickering flames, holding a depth of emotion that she couldn't quite decipher. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. I told you, he said, his voice low and rough. You were promised to me a long time ago, but I don't understand. I don't remember any promise. He sighed, running a hand through his dark, wind-tossed hair. It wasn't your promise to remember, Rosie. It was your father's. And mine. He stood up and walked towards her, stopping a few feet away, the firelight casting dancing shadows on his face. He looked down chapter 4. Beneath a sky of suspicion. He looked down at her, the firelight flickering in his stormy eyes, making them seem both fierce and vulnerable. Your father and I, we were partners once. We rode together, ran cattle together, fought together. We were closer than brothers. Rosie listened, captivated, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. She'd always known her father had a past, a life before he'd settled down and married her mother. But he'd always been tight-lipped about it, dismissing her questions with a gruff wave of his hand. What happened? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rhett turned away, staring into the flames, his silhouette a stark outline against the growing darkness. We made a pact, he said, his voice heavy with regret. A blood oath. We swore that if anything ever happened to either of us, the other would look after their family. And we promised our children to each other. You and me, Rosie. We were betrothed before we were even born. Rosie was stunned. A betrothal? An arranged marriage, just like the one she'd fled? But this felt different. This was a pact made between men who trusted each other, not a transaction brokered for financial gain. But why didn't my father ever tell me? She asked, her voice filled with a mixture of confusion and hurt. Rhett sighed, turning back to face her. Things changed, Rosie. Your father, he changed. He became obsessed with wealth, with power. He made a deal with Collins, a deal that involved selling off land that rightfully belonged to both of us. A Chapter 5. Scars of the Past. A deal that involved betraying our oath, Rhett continued, his voice hardening with a bitter edge. When I confronted him, he denied everything. He claimed I was lying, that I was trying to steal his land. We fought. It got ugly. He paused, his gaze drifting to his left hand, where a jagged scar, pale against his tan skin, ran from his wrist to his knuckles. Rosie hadn't noticed it before, hidden as it was by the long sleeves of his shirt. Now, in the firelight, it stood out, a stark reminder of the violence that had torn apart their families. He tried to kill me, Rosie, Rhett said, his voice low and raw. Left me for dead. I barely survived. When I recovered, I went back for what was rightfully mine, but he'd already sold the land to Collins. And he'd promised you to him, as part of the deal. Rosie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her father, a man she'd always respected, even feared, had betrayed his best friend, had tried to kill him, had sold her off like a piece of property to cover his tracks. It was almost too much to comprehend. I don't know what to say, she stammered, her voice trembling. Rhett reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. You don't have to say anything, Rosie. I know this is a lot to take in. His touch sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of fear and a strange, unfamiliar warmth. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, trying to understand the man behind the outlaw, the man who had risked his life to save her. Why didn't you just take the land back? She asked. Why did you come for me? His gaze held hers unwavering. Because you were part of the oath, Rosie. And because I saw something in you, that day in the church. Something that reminded me of the man your father used to be. Something worth fighting for. His words, spoken with such sincerity, touched her deeply. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that he wasn't just fighting for land or for revenge. He was fighting for something more, something intangible, something that resonated with the deepest part of her being. He was fighting for honor, for loyalty, for the promise of a love that had been stolen from them before they'd even had a chance to claim it. He pulled a worn, leather-bound pouch from his saddlebag and handed it to her. This belonged to your mother, he said. Your father gave it to me years ago as a token of our agreement. Rosie opened the pouch, her hands trembling. Inside, Nestled on a bed of faded velvet was a delicate silver locket, engraved with a single rose. She recognized it instantly. It was her mother's favorite piece of jewelry, a family heirloom passed down through generations. She'd always wondered why her mother had stopped wearing it. Years ago. Now she knew. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of grief for the mother she had lost, tears of anger for the father who had betrayed her, tears of confusion for the uncertain future that lay ahead. But beneath the tears, something else was stirring, a sense of gratitude for the man who had given her this precious memento, a spark of hope for the possibility of a new beginning. She looked up at Rhett, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He nodded, his gaze softening. He reached out and gently wiped away a tear that traced a path down her cheek. "We'll get through this, Rosie," he said, his voice low and reassuring. Together, he spread out a bedroll near the fire, offering it to her. She lay down, exhausted but unable to sleep. The events of the day replayed in her mind, a chaotic jumble of images and emotions. She listened to the crackling of the fire, the soft whinnies of the horses, and Rhett's steady breathing as he sat nearby, keeping watch. The vast, starlit sky stretched above them, a silent witness to their plight. Rosie felt a sense of vulnerability, of being utterly alone in the world, yet she also felt a strange sense of peace. She was with Rhett, a man she barely knew, yet a man she felt she could trust. A man who had shown her, in a single day, more kindness and courage than she had ever known. As she finally drifted off to sleep, she clutched the silver locket in her hand, its cool metal a tangible link to her past, a reminder of the love that had been lost and the hope that might yet be found. The scar on his hand, the locket in hers, these were the anchors in a sea of uncertainty, whispering of broken oaths and a future yet to be written. She fell asleep to the sound of his soft breathing and the distant howl of a coyote, a lonely sound that mirrored the uncertainty of her own heart. Chapter 6. The Outlaw's Code. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, chasing away the shadows of the night. Rosie awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of Rhett moving around the campsite. She sat up, stiff and sore from sleeping on the hard ground, her mind still foggy with sleep. Rhett was already saddling the horses, his movements efficient and practiced. He glanced at her, a slight smile touching his lips. "Morning, Rosie," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Sleep well?" She shook her head, a wry smile on her own lips. "Not really," she admitted. "Too much to think about." He nodded, understanding. "We'll talk more later," he said. "Right now, we need to move. Collins and his men will be looking for us." They ate a quick breakfast of dried meat and hardtack, washing it down with water from the creek. The food was bland and unappetizing, but Rosie was too hungry to care. She realized, with a growing sense of unease, that this was her new reality. A life on the run, a life of hardship and uncertainty. As they mounted their horses, Rhett turned to her, his expression serious. "There are things you need to know, Rosie," he said. "Things about the life I lead, the rules I live by." She listened intently, her gaze fixed on his face. "I'm not a saint, Rosie," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've done things I'm not proud of. I've lived outside the law, because the law hasn't always been just. But I have my own code, a code I live by." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I don't hurt women or children. I don't steal from those who can't afford it. I only take what I need to survive, and I only fight when I have to. But when I do fight," he added, his voice hardening, "I fight to win." Rosie nodded, understanding. She'd already seen evidence of his code, in the way he'd protected her, in the way he'd treated her with respect, despite the circumstances. "There's something else," he said, his voice hesitant. "I have friends, allies, people who help me, who provide me with information, with supplies. They're scattered throughout the territory, some in towns, some out in the wilderness. They're a diverse bunch. Some are outlaws like me. Some are just ordinary folks who believe in what I'm fighting for." He paused, his gaze intense. "You'll meet some of them, Rosie. And you'll need to trust them, just as you trust me. But you also need to be careful. Not everyone can be trusted. There are spies everywhere, men who work for Collins, men who would sell us out for a few dollars. Rosie felt a chill run down her spine. The world he was describing was far more complex, far more dangerous than anything she'd ever imagined. It was a world of hidden alliances, of secret codes, of constant threat. I understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, satisfied. Good. Now we ride. They rode hard throughout the day, pushing their horses to their limits. The landscape gradually changed, from the open plains to a more rugged terrain of canyons and mesas. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the air was thick with dust. Rosie struggled to keep up, her body aching, her spirit flagging. She'd never been a particularly strong rider, preferring the gentle pace of life on the ranch to the wild gallops across the open plains. But she knew she couldn't afford to slow down, not now. Rhett, sensing her fatigue, slowed his pace slightly, riding alongside her. He offered her words of encouragement, pointing out landmarks, sharing stories of the land and its people. He spoke of the Native American tribes who had roamed these lands for centuries, of the pioneers who had braved the wilderness to build new lives, of the outlaws and lawmen who had fought for control of the territory. His stories, though often grim, were captivating, transporting her to another time, another world. They helped to distract her from her exhaustion, from her fear, from the nagging doubts that still plagued her mind. As evening approached, they reached a narrow canyon, its walls rising steeply on either side. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows, painting the rocks in hues of red and gold. We'll camp here for the night, Rhett said, his voice low and cautious. It's a good spot, well hidden, but we need to be careful. This is Apache territory. Rosie felt a shiver of fear, mixed with a strange sense of excitement. She'd heard stories of the Apache, of their fierce warriors, their mastery of the desert, their unwavering resistance to the encroachment of white settlers. Rhett built a small, carefully concealed fire, using dry wood that produced little smoke. They ate another meager meal, sharing the last of their water. As darkness fell, Rosie sat close to the fire, her back against a smooth, warm rock, listening to the sounds of the night. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote, and the soft crackling of the flames. She felt a deep and profound loneliness, a sense of being utterly disconnected. Yet she also felt a strange connection to this ancient land, its timeless beauty, and a growing sense of admiration and the beginnings of something more for the man beside her. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Canyon. The night in the canyon was filled with unsettling sounds. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent shivers down Rosie's spine. She lay wrapped in the bedroll, her eyes wide open, staring up at the sliver of sky visible between the towering canyon walls. The stars seemed impossibly distant, cold, and indifferent to her plight. Rhett sat near the dying embers of the fire, his rifle across his lap, his senses alert. He seemed to be able to blend into the shadows, becoming one with the night. Rosie wondered if he ever truly slept, or if he was always on guard, always watching. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking their every move. The stories Rhett had told her about the Apache, though fascinating, had also filled her with a sense of dread. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Red, do you think they'll find us?" He turned his head, his eyes glinting in the faint light of the embers. "They'll try," he said, his voice low and calm. "But we've covered our tracks well. And this canyon, it's a maze. Only those who know it well can navigate it. But what if they do find us?" He hesitated for a moment, then said, "We'll fight. We'll survive. I promised you a new life, Rosie, and I won't let Collins take that away from you." His words, though meant to be reassuring, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She'd never been in a fight in her life, never even held a gun. The thought of facing Collins and his men, of having to defend herself, terrified her. I don't know if I can do this, Rhett, she confessed, her voice trembling. I'm not strong like you. I'm not brave. He reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. His hand was calloused and rough, but warm, radiating a strength that she found comforting. You are stronger than you think, Rosie, he said, his voice sincere. You've already proven that. You left everything you knew behind to take a chance on a new life on me. That takes courage. His words, and the warmth of his hand in hers, gave her a small measure of comfort. She squeezed his hand, grateful for his presence, for his unwavering belief in her. Tell me more about your friends, she said, changing the subject, trying to distract herself from her fear. The ones who help you. He smiled slightly, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. They're a colorful bunch, he said. There's Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled prospector who knows these canyons like the back of his hand. He's got a nose for gold and a knack for disappearing into thin air. Then there's Maria, a fiery Mexican woman who runs a cantina in a small town near the border. She's got eyes and ears everywhere and a tongue sharper than a scorpion's sting. And there are others. You'll meet them soon enough. He told her stories about his friends, about their adventures, their loyalty, their shared commitment to fighting injustice. His stories painted a picture of a hidden world, a network of rebels and outcasts who lived by their own code, who defied the corrupt authorities and fought for a better future. As he spoke, Rosie began to understand the depth of his commitment, the passion that drove him. He wasn't just an outlaw, a man on the run. He was a leader, a protector, a man who believed in something bigger than himself. And she, by choosing to follow him, had become a part of that something. The night wore on, and the fire slowly died down, leaving them in near darkness. The sounds of the canyon seemed to amplify, every rustle and whisper echoing through the narrow passage. Suddenly, Rhett stiffened, his head cocked to one side. Did you hear that? He whispered. Rosie listened intently. At first, she heard nothing, but then, faintly, she caught the sound of distant, rhythmic drumming coming from somewhere deep within the canyon. What is it? She whispered, her heart pounding. Apache, Rhett said, his voice grim. They know we're here. He stood up, his rifle in his hand, his body tense and alert. He scanned the canyon walls, searching for any sign of movement. Rosie felt a surge of panic. This was it. They were trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling. Rhett didn't answer. He was listening, his eyes fixed on a point high up on the canyon wall. Suddenly, a figure appeared, silhouetted against the faint light of the stars. It was an Apache warrior, standing tall and proud, his feathered headdress a stark outline against the sky. He raised his hand, and the drumming stopped. A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of Rosie's ragged breathing. She waited, her heart in her throat, for the inevitable attack. But the attack didn't come. Instead, the warrior spoke, his voice echoing through the canyon, in a language Rosie didn't understand. Rhett listened intently, his body still tense, but his grip on his rifle slightly relaxed. Then he answered, in the same language, his voice clear and strong. Rosie watched, mesmerized, as the two men conversed. She couldn't understand the words, but she could sense the tension, the respect, the underlying threat. Finally, the warrior nodded, turned, and disappeared back into the shadows. The drumming resumed, but it was fainter now, receding into the distance. Rhett lowered his rifle, his body relaxing slightly. He turned to Rosie, his expression unreadable. What happened? She asked, her voice still trembling. What did he say? Rhett hesitated for a moment, then said, He said we're allowed to pass.
For now.
But we're being watched. We need to be careful. He paused, meeting her gaze. He also said, They know who I am. And they know who you are. The drumming, the conversation, the reprieve, it all left Rosie with the chilling realization that their journey had just entered a far more dangerous and far more complicated phase. And the echoes of the canyon seemed to whisper a warning. They were not just running from Collins, but stepping into a much larger, older conflict. Chapter 8. A Glimmer of Trust. The next morning, they left the canyon under the watchful eyes of the unseen Apache. Rosie felt a constant prickling sensation on her skin, the awareness of being observed, assessed. The landscape, though breathtakingly beautiful, felt hostile, every rock and crevice a potential hiding place for danger. Rhett was unusually quiet, his brow furrowed in concentration. He seemed to be constantly listening, his senses attuned to the subtle nuances of the wilderness. Rosie, though still apprehensive, found herself trusting his instincts, his ability to navigate this perilous terrain. They rode in silence for most of the morning, the only sounds the rhythmic pounding of hooves, the occasional cry of a hawk, and the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. Rosie's thoughts drifted back to the encounter with the Apache warrior. She wondered what Rhett had said to him, what agreement they had reached. Finally, as they stopped to water the horses at a small, spring-fed pool, she couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. "Rhett," she asked, her voice hesitant, "what did you say to that Apache warrior? What did he mean, 'They know who we are'?" Rhett sighed, running a hand through his dusty hair. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and concern. "The Apache, they've been watching me for years," he said. "They know about my fight with Collins, about my reputation." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They respect strength, Rosie. They respect those who fight for what they believe in. But they also test those who enter their territory. They wanted to see if you were worthy of my protection." "And am I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his rugged face. "You are Rosie," he said, his voice soft. "You are braver than you know." His words, and the warmth of his smile, sent a wave of relief through her. She realized, with a growing sense of certainty, that she was beginning to trust him, not just with her safety, but with her heart. "The warrior," Rhett continued, "he said they'd heard of the stolen bride, the woman who defied the wealthy landowner and chose to follow the outlaw. They admire that." Rosie felt a blush creep up her cheeks. The thought of being a legend, a symbol of defiance, was both exhilarating and terrifying. "But," Rhett added, his voice turning serious, "they also warn me. They said Collins has allies among the other tribes who are hostile to the Apache. And he's offered a bounty for our capture, dead or alive." Rosie felt a chill run down her spine. The stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. They weren't just running from Collins and his men, they were caught in the middle of a larger conflict, a war between tribes, between those who sought to exploit the land and those who sought to protect it. "We need to reach my friends," Rhett said, his voice determined. "They can help us, protect us. But it's a long journey, and we need to be careful." They continued their journey, the landscape gradually shifting from the rugged canyons to a more open, rolling terrain. They passed through small, dusty settlements, avoiding contact with the inhabitants, sticking to the back roads and trails. Rhett taught her how to read the signs of the wilderness, how to track animals, how to find water, how to build a fire that produced minimal smoke. He showed her how to handle a rifle, how to shoot, how to defend herself. Rosie, though initially clumsy, proved to be a quick learner. She was determined to be more than just a burden, to be a partner, to contribute to their survival. As the days passed, a subtle shift occurred in their relationship. The initial fear and uncertainty began to give way to a growing sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose. They worked together, seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs, supporting each other's weaknesses. They shared stories, laughed, argued, and even, occasionally, sang. Rosie discovered that Rhett had a surprisingly good singing voice, a deep baritone that resonated with the beauty of the landscape. He taught her old cowboy songs, ballads of love and loss, of courage and betrayal. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, sharing a meager meal of roasted rabbit, Rosie found herself opening up to him, sharing her own stories, her own dreams. She told him about her childhood on the ranch, about her love for horses, about her longing for a life beyond the confines of her father's expectations. Rhett listened intently, his eyes filled with empathy. He didn't judge her, didn't dismiss her dreams. He understood her in a way that no one ever had before. As she spoke, she realized that she was falling in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, passionate infatuation, but a slow, steady burn, a growing affection built on respect, trust, and shared experience. She knew that their future was uncertain, that they faced countless dangers, that their love might be doomed from the start. But in that moment, sitting beside him under the vast, starlit sky, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the connection she felt with him, the warmth of his presence, the promise of a love that was as wild and untamed as the frontier itself. A trust, once just a glimmer, now shone brightly, mirroring the stars above. And for the first time since leaving Harmony Creek, Rosie felt a sense of belonging, a sense of hope, a sense that she had finally found her place in the world. Chapter 9. The Price of Freedom. The journey to Rhett's friends was arduous, fraught with danger at every turn. They rode through scorching deserts, navigated treacherous mountain passes, and forded swift-flowing rivers. They slept under the stars, exposed to the elements, constantly on guard against both human and animal predators. The bounty on their heads, announced by Collins in every town and settlement, made them targets for every bounty hunter, every desperate outlaw, every opportunistic scoundrel in the territory. They had several close calls, narrowly escaping ambushes, outrunning pursuers, and relying on Rhett's quick thinking and even quicker draw to survive. Each encounter, each near miss, took its toll on Rosie. The constant stress, the fear of capture, the physical exhaustion, began to wear her down. She lost weight, her face became gaunt, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. But she never complained, never wavered in her determination to keep up with Rhett, to prove herself worthy of his trust. Rhett, too, was showing the strain. He became even more guarded, more vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his gun. He slept even less, taking the first watch and the last, ensuring Rosie's safety. He worried about her, about the toll this life was taking on her. He'd promised her freedom, a new life, but he'd also brought her into a world of danger and hardship. He began to question his own decisions, his own motives. Was he being selfish, dragging her into his fight? Was he putting her life at risk for his own vengeance? One evening, as they camped in a secluded grove of cottonwood trees, beside a clear, fast-flowing stream, Rhett finally voiced his concerns. "Rosie," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to put you in danger." Rosie looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and understanding. "I know, Rhett," she said, her voice soft. "I chose this. I chose to come with you. But you didn't know you couldn't have known what it would be like," he said, his voice filled with self-reproach. "This life, it's not for you. You deserve better." She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of worry etched into his face. "I deserve to be free, Rhett," she said, her voice firm. "Free to make my own choices, free to love who I choose. And I choose you." Her words, spoken with such conviction, touched him deeply. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes, savoring the warmth of her hand against his skin. "But what if something happens to me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. What if Collins catches us?" She met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "Then we'll face it together, Rhett," she said. "Just like we've faced everything else." He pulled her close, holding her tight, burying his face in her hair. He breathed in the scent of her, a mixture of wood smoke, sweat, and something uniquely her, a scent that had become his anchor, his comfort, his reason for fighting. "I love you, Rosie," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. It was the first time he'd said those words, the first time he'd allowed himself to admit the depth of his feelings. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "I love you too, Rhett," she said, her voice equally emotional. They kissed, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that spoke of shared hardship, of unwavering trust, of a love that had blossomed in the face of adversity. It was a kiss that acknowledged the price of their freedom, the dangers they faced, but also the unwavering commitment they had made to each other. The moment was broken by the distant sound of horses' hooves. Rhett instantly stiffened, his hand moving to his gun. "Someone's coming," he whispered. He pushed Rosie behind him, shielding her with his body, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The sound grew closer, and soon, several riders emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by the darkness. Rosie held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Were they bounty hunters?
Collins' men?
Or something else? As the riders approached, Rhett relaxed slightly, his grip on his gun loosening. He recognized the lead rider, a tall, lean man with a weathered face and a piercing gaze. "Hemlock," Rhett said, a note of relief in his voice. "It's good to see you." Old man Hemlock grinned, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. "Well, now, ain't that a sight for sore eyes," he said, his voice raspy with age. "Rhett Tate and his stolen bride. You two have caused quite a stir, you know that?" He looked at Rosie, a curious expression on his face. "You're a far sight prettier than the rumors say, Miss Dawson. And a damn sight braver, I reckon." Rosie blushed, unsure how to respond. She was relieved that they were safe, for now, but she also knew that their journey was far from over. The price of freedom, she was beginning to understand, was constant vigilance, constant struggle, and a willingness to face the unknown, together. The arrival of Hemlock and his veiled complement served as a reminder. Their escape was not just a personal flight, but a rebellion that had resonated across the territory, making them both symbols and targets. Chapter 10. Hidden Truths in Dusty Corners. Hemlock and his men, a motley crew of 3, each as weathered and rugged as the old prospector himself, shared their camp and their meager supplies with Rhett and Rosie. They were a quiet bunch, men of few words, but their loyalty to Rhett was evident. They treated Rosie with a gruff respect, acknowledging her as Rhett's woman, a partner in his fight. Over the next few days, Hemlock led them through a network of hidden trails, avoiding the main roads and settlements, moving ever closer to Rhett's ultimate destination, a remote ranch nestled high in the mountains, a sanctuary known only to a select few. During their journey, Hemlock shared valuable information, gleaned from his extensive network of contacts. He told them about Colin's growing frustration, his increasingly desperate attempts to capture them. He spoke of the bounty hunters swarming the territory, of the rumors circulating about Rosie's defiance, of the growing support for Rhett among the common folk, who saw him as a symbol of resistance against Colin's tyranny. "Collins is losing his grip," Rhett, Hemlock said one evening, as they sat around a small fire. "He's making enemies, even among his own allies. He's pushing too hard, too fast. Folks are starting to see him for what he is, a greedy, power-hungry tyrant." Rhett nodded, his expression grim.
"He won't give up, though," he said.
"He'll come after us, with everything he's got." "Let him come," Hemlock said, a glint of defiance in his eyes. "We'll be ready for him." He turned to Rosie, his gaze softening slightly. "You've changed things, Miss Dawson," he said. "You've given folks hope. You've shown them that it's possible to stand up to Collins, to fight for what's right." Rosie felt a surge of pride, mixed with a sense of responsibility. She hadn't asked for this role, hadn't sought to become a symbol of rebellion. But she wouldn't shy away from it either. She'd chosen to follow Rhett, to fight alongside him, and she would see it through to the end. One afternoon, as they were riding through a narrow, dusty canyon, Hemlock suddenly reined in his horse, his eyes fixed on a small, seemingly insignificant pile of rocks. "Hold up," he said, his voice low and cautious. He dismounted and carefully examined the rocks, his fingers tracing their contours. He picked up a small, flat stone, revealing a hidden cavity beneath. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried leaves, was a tightly rolled piece of parchment. Hemlock unrolled the parchment, his eyes scanning the contents. His expression changed, his brow furrowing in concern. He looked up at Rhett, his face grim. "What is it?" Rhett asked, his voice tense. "It's a message," Hemlock said. "From Maria." Rosie's heart skipped a beat. Maria, The fiery Mexican woman who ran the cantina near the border was one of Rhett's closest allies. If she'd sent a message, it must be important. She says Collins has found out about the ranch, Hemlock said, his voice heavy with dread. He knows it's your sanctuary, and he's sending a posse, a large one, to flush you out. Rhett's jaw tightened. He'd known this was a possibility, but he'd hoped to have more time to prepare, more time to get Rosie to safety.
How long do we have?
He asked, his voice calm but firm. A few days, maybe less, Hemlock said. They're moving fast. A tense silence fell over the group. The news was devastating, a blow to their hopes of finding refuge. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. Rosie looked at Rhett, her eyes filled with fear, but also with determination. She wouldn't let him face this alone. She'd come this far, and she wouldn't give up now. We'll fight, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. We'll defend the ranch. We'll stand together. Rhett looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and admiration. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. We will, he said, his voice equally determined. We'll fight for our freedom, for our love, for our future. He turned to Hemlock. Gather your men, he said. Send word to the others. Tell them it's time to fight. The hidden message, the dusty canyon, the grim news, it all coalesced into a single, stark truth. The sanctuary they sought was no longer safe, and the final confrontation was now inevitable. Chapter 11. The Sheriff's Pursuit. The news of Collins' approaching posse cast a long shadow over their journey. The urgency of their situation was palpable, every moment precious. They rode harder, pushing their horses to their limits, stopping only for brief rests and snatched moments of sleep. Rhett, driven by a fierce determination to protect Rosie, became even more focused, more intense. He meticulously planned their route, choosing the most difficult and treacherous paths, hoping to slow down their pursuers and buy themselves some time. Rosie, despite her exhaustion and fear, kept pace with him, her spirit unbroken. She had learned much during their weeks on the run, transforming from a sheltered rancher's daughter into a resourceful and resilient woman of the frontier. She could ride, shoot, and survive, skills she'd never imagined needing, but now embraced with a quiet determination. As they neared the ranch, they encountered more of Rhett's allies, small groups of men and women who had heard of his fight and were willing to risk their lives to help him. They provided fresh horses, supplies, and information, bolstering their spirits and strengthening their resolve. One evening, as they camped in a hidden valley, a young man, barely more than a boy, rode into their camp, his horse lathered in sweat, his face pale with fear. He was a scout, sent by one of Rhett's contacts in a nearby town. They're coming, Mr. Tate. He gasped, his voice trembling. The sheriff, he's leading them. He's got dozens of men, heavily armed. And they've got bloodhounds. Rhett's jaw tightened. The sheriff. He hadn't expected that. The sheriff of Harmony Creek, a man named Bartlett, was a corrupt and ruthless official, firmly in Collins' pocket. He was known for his brutality, his willingness to bend the law to serve his own interests. And bloodhounds, that was a serious threat. They could track them through even the most difficult terrain, making escape almost impossible. How far behind are they? Rhett asked, his voice calm but firm. A day, maybe less, the scout said. They're pushing hard. Rhett turned to Rosie, his eyes filled with concern. He knew this was the moment of truth. They were running out of time, running out of options. We need to reach the ranch, he said, his voice determined. It's our only chance. They set off immediately, riding through the night. The darkness, their only ally. The terrain became increasingly rugged, the mountains looming before them, their peaks shrouded in mist. Rosie, her body aching, her mind numb with fatigue, clung to Belle's mane, her eyes fixed on Rhett's back. She trusted him, implicitly, to lead her to safety, to guide her through this nightmare. As dawn approached, they finally reached the foothills of the mountains, the ranch a distant speck in the vast landscape. But as they rode closer, they saw something that made their hearts sink.
Smoke.
a thick column of black smoke rising from the direction of the ranch. "No," Rosie whispered, her voice filled with horror. Rhett spurred his horse into a gallop, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of fury and despair. Rosie followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. As they crested a rise, they saw the ranch, or what was left of it. The buildings were engulfed in flames, the corrals empty, the livestock scattered. The scene was one of utter devastation. Rhett reined in his horse, his body trembling with rage. He dismounted, his gun drawn, his eyes scanning the wreckage, searching for any sign of life, any sign of hope. Rosie dismounted beside him, her legs shaking, her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The sanctuary, the refuge they had fought so hard to reach, was gone. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the smoke, stumbling towards them, his clothes torn and blackened, his face streaked with soot. It was one of Rhett's men, a ranch hand named Jedediah, a different one obviously, much younger, lean and loyal. "Rhett, thank God," he gasped, his voice hoarse. They came at dawn, attacked without warning. We tried to fight, but there were too many." "Who?" Rhett demanded, his voice fierce. "Who did this?" Jedediah coughed, struggling to breathe. "The sheriff and Collins' men, they had help." He gestured weakly towards the mountains. "Apaches, a renegade band. Collins, he paid them to burn us out." Rhett's eyes widened in disbelief. Apaches? Working with Collins? It seemed impossible. The Apache he had encountered had seemed honorable, respectful. But then again, he'd also warned them that Collins had allies among other tribes. Rosie felt a wave of despair wash over her. Everything was falling apart. Their hopes, their dreams, their future all consumed by flames. But Rhett, despite his initial shock, refused to give up. He looked at Rosie, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We're not finished, Rosie," he said, his voice low and resolute. "We'll find them. We'll make them pay. We'll start again." He helped her back onto her horse, his touch gentle but firm. He mounted his own horse, his face set, his eyes burning with a cold fury. They rode away from the burning ranch, leaving behind the wreckage of their hopes, but not their spirit. They were battered, bruised, but not broken. They still had each other, and they still had their love. And that, they knew, was enough to fuel their fight, to guide them through the darkness, to lead them towards a new dawn. The sheriff's pursuit, the burning ranch, the unexpected betrayal, it all served to harden their resolve, transforming their flight into a quest for justice, a vow to reclaim what had been stolen from them. Chapter 12. Crossroads of the Heart. The destruction of the ranch left a gaping wound in their hopes. The sanctuary they had striven for was now ashes, a testament to Collins' reach and ruthlessness. They rode in silence for hours, the weight of their loss pressing down on them, the future uncertain. Rhett, his face a mask of grim determination, led them away from the smoldering ruins towards the rugged mountains that loomed in the distance. He knew they needed a new plan, a new refuge, a new way to fight back. Rosie, her heart heavy with grief, struggled to keep pace with him. She'd lost everything: her home, her family, her dreams of a peaceful life. All that remained was Rhett and the uncertain path that lay before them. As they rode, she began to question her choices, her decision to follow him. Had she made a mistake? Had she traded one form of captivity for another, a gilded cage for a life on the run, a life of constant danger and hardship? She looked at Rhett, his profile etched against the harsh landscape, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination. He was a good man, a brave man, a man she loved. But he was also an outlaw, a man hunted by the law, a man whose life was a constant battle. Was this the life she wanted? Was this the future she had dreamed of? She didn't know anymore. Finally, as they stopped to rest their horses near a small, spring-fed stream, she voiced her doubts, her fears. "Rhett," she said, her voice hesitant, I don't know if I can do this anymore.
I'm tired. I'm scared.
I miss my home." Rhett turned to her, his eyes filled with concern. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. I know, Rosie, he said, his voice soft. I know it's been hard. I never meant for you to suffer like this. It's not your fault, she said, her voice choked with emotion. It's everything. The ranch, the sheriff, Collins, I don't know if I'm strong enough. He pulled her close, holding her tight, burying his face in her hair. You are strong, Rosie, he said, his voice firm. You're the strongest woman I know. You've faced more hardship in the past few weeks than most people face in a lifetime, and you've never given up. You've never lost your spirit. His words, and the warmth of his embrace, gave her a small measure of comfort. But the doubts still lingered, gnawing at her soul. What do we do now, Rhett? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Where do we go? He pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes, his gaze intense. We have options, Rosie, he said. We could keep running, try to disappear, start a new life somewhere far away.
Or we could fight back.
We could find Collins, make him pay for what he's done. He paused, his eyes searching hers. But it's your choice, Rosie. I won't force you to do anything you don't want to do. If you want to leave, I'll understand. I'll help you get back to your family, or wherever you want to go. His offer, his willingness to let her go, surprised her. She'd expected him to be angry, to be disappointed. But instead, he was giving her a choice, respecting her feelings, honoring her freedom. She looked at him, her heart aching. She loved him, more than she'd ever thought possible. But she was also afraid of the future, afraid of the violence, afraid of losing him. She thought of her family, of her mother, of the life she'd left behind. It was a life of comfort, of security, of predictability. But it was also a life of constraints, of expectations, of limited choices. She looked at Red again, at his rugged face, his kind eyes, his unwavering spirit. He offered her a different kind of life, a life of adventure, of freedom, of passionate love. But it was also a life of danger, of uncertainty, of constant struggle. The decision was hers, and hers alone. She stood at a crossroads, her heart torn between two paths, two futures. One path led back to the familiar, to the safety of the known. The other path led forward, into the unknown, towards a future that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the turmoil within her. She thought of the ranch, of the burning buildings, of the faces of Rhett's friends, of the Apache warrior, of the stories Hemlock had told her. She thought of the locket, her mother's locket, the symbol of a love that had been betrayed, a promise that had been broken. She thought of the bounty hunters, of the sheriff, of Collins, of the injustice that had been done to her, to Rhett, to so many others. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting Rhett's. She knew what she had to do. I'm not leaving you, Rhett, she said, her voice firm, her heart resolute. I made a choice and I'll stand by it. We'll fight. We'll find Collins. We'll make him pay. A slow smile spread across Rhett's face, a smile of relief, of gratitude, of love. He pulled her close, kissing her deeply, passionately. Thank you, Rosie, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you for believing in me, for trusting me, for loving me. They stood there, embraced, under the vast, open sky, two souls bound together by love, by loyalty, by a shared commitment to justice. They had reached a crossroads, and they had chosen their path, together. They would face the future, whatever it held, with courage, with determination, and with an unwavering belief in the power of their love. This moment, this decision, marked not an ending, but a turning point, a reaffirmation of their bond, a commitment to a future forged not in escape, but in defiance. Chapter 13. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. With their decision made, Rhett and Rosie turned their focus towards finding Collins and exacting their revenge. Rhett, drawing on his network of contacts, began to gather information, piecing together Collins' movements, his plans, his alliances. He learned that Collins, emboldened by his apparent victory at the ranch, had returned to Harmony Creek, confident that he had crushed all opposition. He was celebrating his triumph, flaunting his wealth and power, and consolidating his control over the territory. Rhett also discovered that Collins had not acted alone in the attack on the ranch. He had indeed hired a renegade band of Apache, led by a ruthless warrior named Chato, to do his dirty work. But there was more. There was a traitor within Rhett's own ranks, someone who had provided Collins with information about the ranch, about its defenses, about Rhett's plans. The revelation of a traitor hit Rhett hard. He had trusted his friends, his allies, implicitly. The thought that one of them had betrayed him, had sold him out to Collins, was a bitter pill to swallow. He kept the news to himself, sharing it only with Rosie. He didn't want to sow distrust and suspicion among his remaining followers, not until he knew who the traitor was. "We need to be careful, Rosie," he said, his voice grim. "We can't trust anyone, not completely. Not until we find out who betrayed us." Rosie nodded, her heart heavy with apprehension. The discovery of a traitor added another layer of danger, another layer of complexity, to their already perilous situation. They decided to return to Harmony Creek to confront Collins directly. It was a risky move, walking straight into the lion's den, but Rhett felt it was the only way to get to the truth, to expose Collins' treachery, and to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. They traveled in disguise, posing as a traveling couple, avoiding the main roads and settlements, sticking to the shadows. Rosie, her hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, her face smudged with dirt, looked almost unrecognizable. Rhett, his beard grown out, his clothes worn and faded, blended in with the rough and tumble crowd that frequented the frontier towns. As they neared Harmony Creek, they sought out Maria, Rhett's trusted ally, the owner of the cantina near the border. They knew she would have information, that she would be able to help them. They found Maria in her cantina, a bustling establishment filled with miners, cowboys, and travelers. She greeted Rhett with a warm embrace, her eyes filled with concern. She treated Rosie with a mixture of respect and curiosity, recognizing her as the woman who had defied Collins and chosen to follow the outlaw. Maria listened intently to their story, her face growing grim as she heard about the destruction of the ranch, about the betrayal, about their plans to confront Collins. "You're walking into a trap, Rhett," she warned, her voice low and urgent. "Collins is expecting you. He's got the whole town under his thumb. The sheriff, the merchants, even some of the townsfolk, they're all afraid of him." "I know the risks, Maria," Rhett said, his voice determined. "But I can't let him get away with this. I need to expose him, to make him pay." Maria sighed, her eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "I'll help you, Rhett," she said. "But be careful. Collins is a dangerous man, and he has friends in high places." She provided them with information about Collins' movements, about his security arrangements, about the layout of the town. She also gave them a name that chilled Rhett to the bone. "The traitor, Rhett," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Samuel. Samuel. Rosie's childhood friend, the one who had left Harmony Creek to seek his fortune. The one Rhett had trusted, had confided in, had considered a friend." Rhett felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Samuel? It couldn't be. He'd known Samuel since they were boys. They'd ridden together, fought together, shared secrets. "Are you sure, Maria?" he asked, his voice trembling. Maria nodded, her eyes filled with sadness. "I have proof, Rhett," she said. "He's been sending messages to Collins, receiving payments. He sold you out for money." Rhett felt a rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. Betrayal by a stranger was one thing, but betrayal by a friend, a trusted companion, was a wound that cut deep, a wound that might never heal. And the added layer of Rosie's connection to Samuel made the betrayal all the more devastating. Rosie, who had been listening in stunned silence, felt a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. Samuel? Her childhood friend? The boy she'd once shared secrets with, laughed with, dreamed with? It was impossible to comprehend. She looked at Rhett, her eyes filled with tears. "Rhett, I don't believe it," she whispered. "Samuel," Rhett reached out and took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I know, Rosie," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "It's hard to believe, but we have to face the truth. We have to be strong." He turned back to Maria.
Thank you, Maria, he said.
For everything. He and Rosie left the cantina, their hearts heavy with grief and betrayal. They walked in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them. As they reached the outskirts of Harmony Creek, Rhett stopped, turning to Rosie, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. We'll confront them both, Rosie, he said. Collins and Samuel. We'll expose their treachery. We'll make them pay. The bitter sting of betrayal, the revelation of Samuel's treachery, transformed their quest for revenge into something more profound, a test of loyalty, a reckoning with the past, and a confrontation not just with their enemies, but with the shattered remnants of their own trust. Chapter 14. A Dance with Danger. Entering Harmony Creek felt like stepping into a viper's nest. The town, once familiar to Rosie, now felt alien and hostile. The faces of the townsfolk, once friendly or indifferent, were now filled with a mixture of fear and suspicion. They whispered behind their hands as Rhett and Rosie passed, their eyes darting nervously towards the sheriff's office, towards Colin's opulent mansion that loomed over the town square. Rhett, his senses on high alert, guided Rosie through the back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares. He knew they were being watched, that every move they made was being reported to Collins. Their plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. They intended to confront Collins publicly during the evening's festivities at the town saloon, the Golden Nugget. It was a gamble, but Rhett felt it was the only way to expose Collins' treachery to the entire town, to turn the people against him. They spent the afternoon hidden in a dilapidated shack on the outskirts of town, preparing for the confrontation. Rosie cleaned and loaded Rhett's spare revolver, her hands surprisingly steady despite the turmoil in her heart. She'd come a long way from the sheltered rancher's daughter, who'd been afraid of guns. Rhett checked his own weapons, his movements precise and economical. He was a man transformed, his grief and betrayal channeled into a cold, focused fury. He was ready to face Collins, ready to face Samuel, ready to face whatever came their way. As dusk settled, they made their way to the Golden Nugget. The saloon was packed, the air thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and cigar smoke. The piano player was banging out a lively tune, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the room. Collins was holding court at a large table in the center of the room, surrounded by his cronies, including the corrupt Sheriff Bartlett. Samuel was there too, standing slightly apart from the others, his face pale and drawn, his eyes avoiding contact with anyone. Rhett and Rosie entered the saloon, their presence causing an immediate hush to fall over the room. All eyes turned towards them, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and anticipation on their faces. Rhett walked directly towards Colin's table, his steps deliberate, his gaze unwavering. Rosie followed close behind, her hand resting on the butt of the revolver tucked into her waistband. Collins looked up, a smug smile on his face. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look who's decided to grace us with their presence. The outlaw and his stolen bride. This isn't about a bride, Collins, Rhett said, his voice cold and hard. This is about justice. This is about you paying for your crimes.
Crime?
Collins scoffed. I haven't committed any crimes. I'm a law-abiding citizen, a pillar of this community. You're a liar, a thief, and a murderer, Rhett retorted, his voice ringing out across the room. You burned down my ranch, you stole my land, and you paid a renegade band of Apaches to do your dirty work. Collins laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. You have no proof, Tate, he said. It's just your word against mine. I have more than my word, Rhett said. He turned to Samuel, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. I have the word of your accomplice. Samuel, tell them. Tell them how you betrayed me, how you sold me out to Collins for a few pieces of silver. All eyes turned to Samuel, who flinched under Rhett's gaze. He looked like a trapped animal, his face contorted with guilt and shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Collins, seeing his opportunity, stood up, his face red with fury.
Don't listen to him,
he shouted. He's lying. He's trying to turn you against me. He signaled to Sheriff Bartlett, who stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "You're under arrest, Tate," he said, his voice menacing, "for murder, theft, and inciting a riot." The saloon was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Rhett stood his ground, his eyes locked on Collins. "This isn't over, Collins," he said. "The truth will come out. And you will pay for what you've done." Suddenly, Rosie stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "He's not lying," she said, addressing the crowd. "I was there. I saw what Collins did. He's a cruel, ruthless man who cares only about himself. He doesn't care about you, about this town. He only cares about his own greed." Her words, spoken with such conviction, had an impact. The townsfolk, who had initially been swayed by Collins' wealth and power, began to murmur among themselves, questioning, doubting. Samuel, finally finding his voice, stepped forward, his eyes filled with tears. "She's right," he said, his voice trembling. I did it. I betrayed Rhett.
Collins, he paid me.
I was weak. I was greedy."
I'm sorry.
His confession, a complete and utter unraveling, was a turning point. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of shouts and accusations. Sheriff Bartlett, seeing the tide turning, hesitated, his hand still on his gun, but his resolve wavering. The carefully orchestrated scene, the dance with danger, had reached its climax, and the truth, raw and undeniable, was finally exposed. It was a moment of profound shift, where loyalties were tested and the balance of power in Harmony Creek teetered precariously on the edge of a knife. Chapter 15. The Whispers of Redemption. Samuel's confession shattered the carefully constructed facade Collins had maintained. The saloon, once filled with a tense silence, now buzzed with a mixture of outrage, disbelief, and a growing sense of betrayal. The townsfolk, who had long lived under Collins' shadow of fear and intimidation, began to see him for what he truly was, a corrupt and ruthless tyrant. Collins, his face contorted with rage and desperation, tried to regain control, shouting denials, threats, and accusations. But his words fell on deaf ears. The people of Harmony Creek, emboldened by Rosie's courage and Samuel's confession, had finally found their voice. Sheriff Bartlett, seeing his authority crumbling, made a desperate attempt to arrest Rhett, but the crowd surged forward, forming a protective barrier around him and Rosie. They were no longer afraid of Collins, no longer willing to tolerate his injustice. Collins, realizing that he had lost, made a run for it, pushing his way through the crowd towards the back door of the saloon. Rhett, his eyes burning with a cold fury, pursued him, his gun drawn. The chase led them through the dusty streets of Harmony Creek, past the shuttered windows and frightened faces of the townsfolk. Collins, desperate and panicked, fired shots wildly, but Rhett, his aim steady and true, returned fire, his bullets finding their mark. Collins stumbled, wounded, but continued to run, heading towards the outskirts of town, towards the open plains. Rhett followed close behind, his determination unwavering. Finally, as Collins reached the edge of town, he collapsed, his strength failing, his body riddled with bullets. He lay there, gasping for breath, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. Rhett stood over him, his gun pointed at Collins' head. He could end it there, with a single pull of the trigger. He could exact his revenge, avenge the destruction of his ranch, the betrayal of his friend, the suffering of so many. But as he looked down at Collins, at his broken and defeated body, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. Revenge, he realized, wouldn't bring back his ranch, wouldn't erase the pain, wouldn't heal the wounds. It would only perpetuate the cycle of violence, the cycle of hatred. He lowered his gun, his hand trembling. He couldn't do it. He couldn't kill a man in cold blood, even a man as vile as Collins. "It's over, Collins," he said, his voice low and weary. "You're finished." He turned and walked away, leaving Collins to his fate. He knew the townsfolk would deal with him, that justice, in its own way, would be served. As he walked back towards the saloon, he saw Rosie, standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by the cheering townsfolk. She was smiling, her face radiant, her eyes filled with pride and relief. She ran towards him, embracing him tightly, her body trembling with emotion. "You did it, Rhett," she whispered. "You did it." He held her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, finding solace in her warmth, in her love. He'd faced his demons, he'd confronted his enemies, and he'd emerged victorious, not through violence, but through truth, through courage, through the unwavering support of the woman he loved. As the townsfolk gathered around them, offering their thanks, their apologies, their support, Rhett realized that he had not only defeated Collins, but he had also won something far more valuable, the respect and admiration of the people of Harmony Creek. He had become a symbol of hope, a symbol of resistance, a symbol of redemption. Samuel, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with remorse, approached Rhett, his head bowed. "Rhett, I don't know what to say," he stammered. I betrayed you. I betrayed everyone. I deserve whatever punishment you see fit." Rhett looked at him, his heart filled with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and pity. He saw not a hardened criminal, but a broken man, a man consumed by guilt and regret. He reached out and placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "We all make mistakes, Samuel," he said, his voice low and compassionate. "We all fall prey to temptation. What matters is what we do after we fall. Do we stay down, or do we get back up? Do we wallow in our guilt, or do we seek redemption?" Samuel looked up at him, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. I want to make amends, Rhett," he said. "I want to help you rebuild. I want to earn back your trust." Rhett nodded, his heart softening. He knew that Samuel's road to redemption would be long and arduous, but he also believed in the power of forgiveness, in the possibility of change. "You'll have your chance, Samuel," he said. "We all will." The whispers of redemption, the tentative steps towards forgiveness, marked a new beginning for Harmony Creek, a beginning built not on violence and revenge, but on truth, justice, and the enduring power of the human spirit to heal and to forgive. Rhett's choice, his refusal to kill Collins, had set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in the town, paving the way for a future where reconciliation, not retribution, would be the guiding principle. Chapter 16. Fireside Confessions. With Collins defeated and the truth revealed, a sense of cautious optimism settled over Harmony Creek. The townsfolk, freed from the grip of fear and intimidation, began the slow process of rebuilding their lives, their community, their trust. Rhett and Rosie, hailed as heroes, were offered a place to stay in the town's small hotel, the only building that had escaped Collins' wrath. They gratefully accepted, exhausted from their ordeal, but also wary of lingering threats, of unseen enemies who might still be lurking in the shadows. Sheriff Bartlett, stripped of his authority and facing charges of corruption and complicity, was replaced by a temporary sheriff, a respected rancher named Johnson, who had been a silent opponent of Collins' rule. Johnson, with Rhett's support, began to restore order, to ensure justice, to rebuild the town's shattered confidence. Samuel, ostracized by some, but forgiven by others, dedicated himself to making amends for his betrayal. He worked tirelessly, helping to rebuild the homes that had been damaged, assisting the families who had suffered losses, offering his services to anyone who needed help. He was a shadow of his former self, his arrogance and greed replaced by humility and remorse. One evening, as Rhett and Rosie sat by the fireplace in the hotel's common room, sharing a quiet moment together, Samuel approached them, his head bowed, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and hope. "Rhett, Rosie," he said, his voice hesitant, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to thank you for not killing me, for giving me a chance to make things right." Rhett looked at him, his expression unreadable. He had struggled with his feelings towards Samuel, with the anger and betrayal that still lingered in his heart. But he also recognized the genuine remorse in Samuel's eyes, the sincerity of his desire to redeem himself. We all make mistakes, Samuel, Rhett said, his voice low and even. What matters is what we learn from them, what we do to make amends. Rosie, her heart filled with compassion, reached out and took Samuel's hand. We were friends once, Samuel, she said, her voice soft. I know there's still good in you. I believe you can change. Her words and her touch brought tears to Samuel's eyes. He squeezed her hand, his gratitude evident. I won't let you down, Rosie, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I swear it. He turned to Rhett. I also wanted to tell you something, he said. Something about Collins, about his plans. Rhett raised an eyebrow. His interest piqued. What is it? Samuel hesitated for a moment, then said, Collins, he wasn't working alone. He had partners, powerful men in the territory, men who were backing him, who were profiting from his schemes. Rhett's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. Collins, for all his ruthlessness, was ultimately a small-time crook, a pawn in a larger game. Who are they, Samuel? He asked, his voice intense. Tell me their names. Samuel looked around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. I don't know all their names, he said. But I know one of them. A man named Senator Blackwood. Senator Blackwood. The name was familiar to Rhett. Blackwood was a powerful and influential politician, a man known for his ambition, his ruthlessness, and his connections to the railroad, the mining industry, and other powerful interests. Blackwood, Rhett muttered, his mind racing. He realized that Collins' defeat was only the first step, that the true enemy, the true threat, was far greater, far more powerful. He's the one who orchestrated everything, Rhett, Samuel said. He's the one who wanted your land, who wanted to control the water rights, who wanted to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. Rosie, listening intently, felt a chill run down her spine. The scope of the conspiracy, the level of corruption, was far greater than she had ever imagined. We need to expose him, Rhett, she said, her voice determined. We need to bring him to justice. Rhett nodded, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of purpose. He had thought the fight was over, that he could finally find peace, that he could finally build a new life with Rosie. But he realized that the fight was far from over, that it had only just begun. We will, Rosie, he said, his voice firm. We'll expose Blackwood and all his cronies. We'll fight for justice, for the people of Harmony Creek, for everyone who has suffered under their tyranny. He looked at Samuel, his expression softening slightly. And you, Samuel, he said. You can help us. You can be our witness, our informant. You can help us bring them down. Samuel nodded, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. He had betrayed them once, but now, he had a chance to redeem himself, to become a part of something bigger, something meaningful. The fireside confessions, the revelation of a larger conspiracy, marked a turning point in their journey, transforming their personal quest for revenge into a broader fight for justice, a fight that would test their courage, their loyalty, and their love in ways they could never have imagined. The warmth of the fire, the quiet intimacy of the moment, contrasted sharply with the looming threat, the daunting task that lay ahead, a task that would require them to confront not just individuals, but a system of corruption that reached far beyond the dusty streets of Harmony Creek. Chapter 17. The Approaching Storm. The revelation of Senator Blackwood's involvement cast a long shadow over their fragile peace. Rhett and Rosie knew that confronting a man of Blackwood's power and influence would be a dangerous and daunting task. He was a man who controlled politicians, judges, and law enforcement, a man who could make people disappear without a trace. They spent the next few days gathering information, piecing together Blackwood's network of corruption, identifying his allies, his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities. Samuel, eager to make amends for his past betrayal, proved to be an invaluable asset, providing them with insider knowledge, with details about Blackwood's operations, with names and locations. Rhett also reached out to his remaining allies, to Old Man Hemlock, to Maria, to others who had stood by him in the past. He knew he would need their help, their support, their expertise, if he was to have any chance of success. As they prepared for their next move, a sense of unease, of impending doom, settled over Harmony Creek. The townsfolk, though grateful for their newfound freedom, were also fearful, aware that Blackwood's wrath would be swift and brutal. One evening, as Rhett and Rosie were meeting with Hemlock and a few other trusted allies in the back room of the rebuilt saloon, a messenger arrived, his horse lathered in sweat, his face pale with fear. "They're coming," he gasped, his voice trembling. "Blackwood's men, they're riding towards Harmony Creek." A whole army of them led by Chato.
Chato.
The renegade Apache warrior who had burned down Rhett's ranch, who had colluded with Collins. The news sent a chill through the room. It seemed Blackwood was not content with simply eliminating Rhett. He wanted to crush the entire town, to make an example of them, to ensure that no one would ever dare to challenge his authority again. Rhett's jaw tightened. He had hoped to have more time to prepare, more time to gather his forces. But Blackwood had forced his hand. He had to act now, to defend Harmony Creek, to protect the people who had placed their trust in him. "How many?" he asked, his voice calm but firm.
"Dozens," the messenger said.
"Maybe more. Heavily armed. And they've got cannons."
Cannons.
The news was devastating. Cannons could level the entire town, could slaughter innocent men, women, and children. Harmony Creek, with its wooden buildings and limited defenses, was no match for such firepower. A tense silence fell over the room. Everyone looked at Rhett, waiting for his decision, waiting for his leadership. Rhett knew that a direct confrontation was suicide. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy with superior firepower. He had to find another way, a way to protect the town, a way to defeat Blackwood without sacrificing innocent lives. He looked at Rosie, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. He knew this was a fight he had to face, a fight he couldn't avoid. But he also wanted to protect her, to keep her safe. "Rosie," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I want you to leave Harmony Creek. Go with Hemlock. He'll take you to a safe place, somewhere Blackwood can't reach you." Rosie shook her head, her eyes filled with defiance. "No, Rhett," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not leaving you. I'm staying here, to fight alongside you." He tried to reason with her, to persuade her, but she was adamant. She wouldn't abandon him, wouldn't abandon the people of Harmony Creek. She had chosen this path, and she would see it through to the end. Rhett sighed, his heart filled with a mixture of love and frustration. He knew he couldn't force her to leave, that her spirit was as untamed as the frontier itself. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "But you stay close to me.
And you do exactly as I say."
He turned to the others, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "We have a fight on our hands," he said, his voice strong and resolute. "A fight we may not win, but we won't back down. We won't surrender. We'll fight for our freedom, for our homes, for our future." He outlined his plan, a desperate gamble, a plan that relied on surprise, on cunning, on the element of chaos. It was a plan that could very well get them all killed, but it was the only chance they had. The plan was complex, dangerous, and relied on perfect timing. If executed correctly, it could give them an advantage, a chance to level the playing field, a glimmer of hope in the face of overwhelming odds. The approaching storm, the threat of Blackwood's army, had forced their hand, pushing them towards a final confrontation, a battle that would determine not only their fate, but the fate of Harmony Creek, and perhaps the fate of the entire territory. As night fell, the tension in the air was palpable, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of thunder, a fitting prelude to the storm that was about to break. Chapter 18. Blood and Sacrifice. As Blackwood's forces, a menacing horde of mercenaries and hired guns led by the ruthless Chato, approached Harmony Creek, the town became a scene of frantic preparation. Rhett's plan, audacious in its conception and perilous in its execution, was set in motion. The townsfolk, armed with whatever weapons they could find, rifles, shotguns, pistols, even pitchforks and axes, barricaded the streets, fortified the buildings, and prepared for a desperate defense. They knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were determined to fight for their homes, for their freedom, for their lives. Rosie, refusing to be sidelined, worked alongside the other women, preparing bandages, tending to the wounded, and offering words of comfort and encouragement. She was a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness, her courage and determination inspiring those around her. Rhett, his face grim, his eyes burning with a cold fury, orchestrated the defense, positioning his men, setting traps, and preparing for the inevitable onslaught. He knew that the odds were stacked against them, but he refused to give up, refused to surrender. As the first rays of dawn pierced the darkness, Blackwood's army arrived, a terrifying spectacle of armed men and thundering cannons. They formed a line on the outskirts of town, their presence a menacing threat, a promise of destruction. Chato, mounted on a powerful black stallion, rode forward, his face painted in war paint, his eyes filled with a savage glee. He raised his hand, signaling the attack. The cannons roared, their deafening blasts shaking the ground, sending plumes of smoke and debris into the air. The first volley ripped through the town, shattering buildings, tearing apart barricades, and inflicting casualties. The battle had begun. Rhett's men, hidden in fortified positions, returned fire, their rifles and shotguns barking defiance. They fought with a desperate courage, knowing that they were fighting for their very survival. The streets of Harmony Creek became a scene of chaos and carnage. Bullets whizzed through the air, explosions rocked the ground, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the shouts of the combatants. Rosie, working tirelessly in a makeshift hospital setup in the rebuilt saloon, tended to the injured, her hands stained with blood, her heart aching with each new casualty. She saw men she knew, men she had grown up with, fall before her eyes, their lives cut short by Blackwood's greed and ambition. Rhett, leading the defense from the front lines, fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He moved from position to position, rallying his men, directing their fire, and inspiring them to keep fighting. He saw Samuel, fighting bravely alongside the other townsfolk, his face determined, his eyes filled with a newfound courage. He saw Old Man Hemlock, his weathered face grim, his aim steady and true, picking off enemy soldiers with deadly accuracy. He saw Maria, armed with a shotgun, defending the saloon with a fierce determination, her eyes blazing with defiance. He saw the townsfolk, men and women, young and old, fighting side by side, their courage fueled by a shared sense of community, a shared determination to protect their homes, their families, their freedom. As the battle raged, Rhett's plan began to unfold. A small group of his men, led by Hemlock, infiltrated the enemy lines, their mission to disable the cannons, to silence the devastating firepower that was tearing the town apart. It was a suicide mission, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. Hemlock and his men, moving stealthily through the chaos, reached the cannons, engaging the enemy soldiers in a fierce hand-to-hand combat. They fought with a savage intensity, knowing that the fate of Harmony Creek rested on their shoulders. One by one, Hemlock's men fell, their bodies riddled with bullets, their sacrifices buying precious time. Finally, only Hemlock remained, facing a dozen enemy soldiers, his body wounded, his strength failing. But he refused to give up. With a final, desperate effort, he reached the cannons, planting explosives, igniting the fuses. He turned to face the approaching enemy soldiers, a defiant grin on his face. "Go to hell," he muttered, his voice raspy. The explosives detonated, a massive explosion that ripped through the air, silencing the cannons, and taking Hemlock's life with them. His sacrifice, his ultimate act of courage, turned the tide of the battle. With the cannon silenced, the balance of power shifted. Rhett's men, emboldened by Hemlock's sacrifice, surged forward, pushing back Blackwood's forces, driving them out of the town. The battle raged for hours, a bloody and brutal struggle, but finally, as the sun began to set, Blackwood's army, demoralized and depleted, retreated, leaving behind a scene of devastation and carnage. Harmony Creek had survived, but at a terrible cost. Many lives had been lost, many homes destroyed, many wounds inflicted. But the town had held, its spirit unbroken, its courage undimmed. Rhett, his body battered and bruised, his clothes torn and stained with blood, stood in the middle of the devastated town square, surrounded by the survivors. He looked at Rosie, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and relief. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We did it, Rosie," he said, his voice hoarse. "We won." But even in victory, there was a profound sense of loss, a recognition of the sacrifices that had been made. The blood and sacrifice, the devastating battle, had secured their immediate survival, but the war, they knew, was far from over. Blackwood was still out there, and he would be back. Chapter 19. A New Dawn's Embrace. The aftermath of the battle was a somber tableau of grief and resilience. Harmony Creek, battered and bruised, began the arduous task of burying its dead, tending to its wounded, and rebuilding its shattered homes and lives. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, of blood, of loss, but also with a nascent sense of hope, a fragile belief in a future free from Blackwood's tyranny. Rhett and Rosie, their bodies exhausted, their hearts heavy with sorrow, worked tirelessly alongside the townsfolk, offering comfort, support, and leadership. They had become symbols of hope, of resistance, of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity. Samuel, his past betrayal forgiven but not forgotten, worked harder than anyone, driven by a deep-seated need to make amends, to prove his loyalty, to earn back the trust he had lost. He was a changed man, his arrogance and greed replaced by humility and a genuine desire to serve his community. The death of Old Man Hemlock, a sacrifice that had turned the tide of the battle, cast a long shadow over the town. He was mourned as a hero, his memory honored with a solemn ceremony, his grave marked with a simple stone, inscribed with the words, "He died for freedom." As the days turned into weeks, Harmony Creek slowly began to heal. Homes were rebuilt, businesses reopened, and life, in its own way, returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the scars of the battle remained, etched into the landscape, etched into the hearts and minds of the people. Rhett, despite his victory, knew that the fight was far from over. Blackwood was still out there, licking his wounds, plotting his revenge. He was a powerful man, with vast resources and influential allies. He would not give up easily. Rhett decided that he could no longer remain in Harmony Creek, that his presence there was putting the town at risk. He needed to take the fight to Blackwood, to confront him on his own turf, to expose his corruption and bring him to justice. He gathered his remaining allies, a small but loyal band of men and women who had stood by him through thick and thin. He shared his plan with them, a plan that was even more audacious, even more dangerous, than the defense of Harmony Creek. He intended to travel to the state capital, to confront Blackwood in his seat of power, to expose his crimes to the authorities, to the press, to the public. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance he had to end Blackwood's reign of terror once and for all. Rosie, despite her fears, insisted on accompanying him. She had stood by him through everything, and she would not abandon him now. She had become his partner, his confidant, his equal, and she would share his fate, whatever it may be. Before they left Harmony Creek, Rhett and Rosie stood before Hemlock's grave, paying their respects to the man who had sacrificed his life for their freedom. "We won't let your sacrifice be in vain, old friend," Rhett said, his voice choked with emotion. "We'll finish this fight. We'll bring Blackwood down." Rosie placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave, her tears mingling with the morning dew. "Thank you, Hemlock," she whispered, "for everything." They turned and walked away, hand in hand, towards the rising sun, towards a new dawn, a new beginning. They knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, filled with danger and uncertainty. But they were ready. They were united. They were determined. As they rode out of Harmony Creek, the townsfolk gathered to see them off, their faces filled with a mixture of gratitude, respect, and hope. They cheered, they waved, they offered prayers for their safe return. Rhett and Rosie, their hearts filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination, rode towards the horizon, towards a future that was uncertain, but also filled with the promise of justice, the promise of freedom, the promise of a love that had endured through fire and blood, a love that had been forged in the crucible of adversity, a love that would guide them, protect them, and sustain them on their perilous journey. The new dawn, a symbol of hope and renewal, embraced them as they rode away, carrying with them the hopes and prayers of a town that had found its courage, its voice, and its soul in the midst of devastation. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The journey to the state capital was long and arduous, filled with the constant threat of discovery and capture. Rhett and Rosie, traveling in disguise and relying on the help of a network of sympathizers, moved cautiously, avoiding the main roads and sticking to the shadows. They knew that Blackwood's reach extended far and wide, that his spies and informants were everywhere. Upon reaching the capital, a sprawling city of imposing buildings and bustling streets, they found a stark contrast to the dusty plains of Harmony Creek. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, of industry, of ambition. The city was a hive of activity, a center of power, a place where fortunes were made and lost, where political deals were brokered, where justice was often bought and sold. They secured a small, discreet lodging in a quiet neighborhood, far from the opulent mansions and government buildings where Blackwood held court. They began to gather information, to map out Blackwood's movements, his habits, his connections. Samuel, who had accompanied them, proved to be an invaluable asset, using his knowledge of Blackwood's operations to guide them, to warn them of potential dangers, to open doors that would otherwise have remained closed. Rhett, with the help of his contacts, managed to secure a meeting with a crusading journalist, a man named Harrison, who had a reputation for exposing corruption and fighting for justice. Harrison, initially skeptical, was eventually convinced by Rhett's evidence, by Rosie's testimony, by Samuel's confession. He agreed to publish their story, to expose Blackwood's crimes to the world. The publication of the article, a scathing expose of Blackwood's corruption, his land grabs, his intimidation tactics, and his involvement in the attack on Harmony Creek, sent shockwaves through the capital. Blackwood, furious and desperate, tried to suppress the story, to discredit Rhett and Rosie, to silence Harrison. But it was too late. The truth was out. Public opinion turned against Blackwood, and his political allies began to distance themselves from him. The governor, under pressure from the public and from rival politicians, ordered an investigation into Blackwood's activities. Blackwood, realizing that his empire was crumbling, decided to make one final, desperate move. He ordered his men to capture Rhett and Rosie, to silence them permanently. One evening, as Rhett and Rosie were returning to their lodging, they were ambushed by Blackwood's men. A fierce gunfight erupted in the narrow streets, the sound of gunfire echoing through the night. Rhett and Rosie, outnumbered and outgunned, fought bravely, defending themselves with a skill and determination born of weeks of hardship and struggle. Samuel, fighting alongside them, proved his loyalty, his courage, his redemption. The fight was brutal, a desperate struggle for survival. Rhett was wounded, a bullet grazing his arm, but he continued to fight, protecting Rosie, protecting Samuel, protecting their hope for justice. Rosie, her heart pounding with fear, but her spirit unbroken, fought with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She had come a long way from the sheltered rancher's daughter who had been afraid of guns. She was now a warrior, a fighter, a woman who would not back down. Finally, as the police arrived, alerted by the sound of gunfire, Blackwood's men retreated, leaving behind a scene of chaos and bloodshed. Rhett, Rosie, and Samuel, battered and bruised, but alive, were taken into protective custody. The final confrontation came not in a dusty saloon or on a windswept plain, but in a courtroom, a place of law, of justice, of reckoning. Blackwood, facing a mountain of evidence, a chorus of accusations, and a hostile public, was finally brought to trial. The trial was a sensation, attracting national attention. Rhett and Rosie, their faces gracing the front pages of newspapers, became symbols of resistance, of courage, of the fight against corruption. Samuel, testifying against his former benefactor, provided damning evidence, exposing Blackwood's crimes, his lies, his treachery. His testimony, a final act of redemption, sealed Blackwood's fate. The jury, after a short deliberation, returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Blackwood, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with defeat, was sentenced to a long prison term, his empire shattered, his reputation ruined. As the verdict was announced, a cheer erupted in the courtroom. Justice, at long last, had been served. Rhett and Rosie, their arms around each other, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, looked at each other, their eyes filled with love, with gratitude, with the quiet understanding of a shared journey, a shared victory. They had faced their demons, they had confronted their enemies, and they had emerged triumphant. They had fought for justice, for freedom, for love, and they had won. Their final confrontation, a culmination of their journey, had brought them not only justice, but a profound sense of closure, a resolution to the conflicts that had driven them, and a clear path towards a future they could finally build together, a future free from fear, from violence, from the shadows of the past. The horizon stretched before them, vast and open, filled with the promise of a new dawn. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of love, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Rhett and Rosie returned to Harmony Creek, not as outlaws, but as heroes, their names etched in the annals of the frontier, their story a legend whispered around campfires and told in hushed tones in saloons. They rebuilt the ranch, not as a monument to the past, but as a symbol of hope, a testament to their shared dream of a peaceful and prosperous future. The land, once scarred by violence and betrayal, slowly began to heal, blossoming anew under their care. Samuel, his past forgiven and his spirit renewed, became an integral part of the community, a respected rancher, a trusted friend, and a living embodiment of redemption. He married a local woman, raised a family, and lived a life of quiet dignity, forever grateful for the second chance he had been given. Harmony Creek, once a town divided by fear and intimidation, flourished under a new era of justice and cooperation. The townsfolk, inspired by Rhett and Rosie's courage, worked together to build a thriving community, a place where everyone had a voice, where everyone had a chance, where everyone could live in peace and security. Rhett and Rosie, their love deepened and strengthened by their shared trials, built a life filled with laughter, with companionship, with the quiet joys of everyday existence. They raised a family, their children growing up strong and free, imbued with the spirit of the frontier, with the values of honesty, integrity, and courage. They often rode together, across the vast plains, under the endless sky, reminiscing about their past, about their adventures, about the hardships they had overcome. They remembered those who had fallen, those who had sacrificed their lives for freedom, and they honored their memory by living their lives to the fullest, by cherishing every moment, by embracing the beauty and the wonder of the world around them. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold, Rosie turned to Rhett, her eyes filled with love and contentment. "We did it, Rhett," she said, her voice soft and serene. "We built a new life, a better life." Rhett smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his face weathered and lined, but filled with a deep and abiding peace. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We did it together, Rosie," he said, his voice equally serene. "And that's all that matters." They sat there, in silence, hand in hand, watching the stars emerge, one by one, in the vast, darkening sky. The air was still, the silence broken only by the gentle chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, and the soft, rhythmic beating of their hearts. Their journey had been long and arduous, filled with danger, with hardship, with loss. But it had also been a journey of love, of courage, of resilience, of transformation. They had faced their demons, They had conquered their fears, and they had emerged victorious, their love stronger, their spirits unbroken, their future secure. As they looked out at the vast, starlit expanse, they knew that their story, their legend, would live on, whispered on the wind, carried across the plains, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a testament to the transformative power of love, a testament to the promise of a new dawn, a new beginning, a new frontier. The vast, open sky, the quiet peace of the ranch, the enduring love between them, it all spoke of a journey completed, a future secured, and a legend forever etched in the heart of the West. The end.